Hi, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Read and Write with Natasha. We're doing this actually live. I'm so pleased to have with me today author David Gregory, who is the author of Dinner with a Perfect Stranger, A Day with a Perfect Stranger, The Next Level, The Last Christian, and the co author of the nonfiction, The Rest of the Gospel. After a 10-year business career, he returned to school to study religion and communications, earning master's degree from Dallas Theological Seminary and the University of North Texas. David, welcome to the show. I am so glad to have you here, and I am excited to talk about a topic I've never talked about on this show after almost 3 years, which is Christian fiction. I know, I mean, correct me if I'm mistaken, that Christian fiction is huge. But first, what got you into Christian fiction?
Well, Natasha, thanks so much for having me on. I've been looking forward to chatting with you and spending some time together. Actually, what got me into Christian fiction, I started off writing nonfiction. My very first book was called The Rest of the Gospel, and I co-authored it. It was a Christian living kind of book, and I
Okay.
co-authored it with a former pastor named Dan Stone. And
Okay.
after that, I went to seminary, and I took a course on creative writing there, and another course on creativity.
Okay.
And I just got the idea. There's some material I wanted to put into book form, and I got the idea. Why don't you put this into a story form? And
Okay.
so this story kind of started gelling in my mind of just having a modern day skeptic. He was in his 30s from Cincinnati, and he receives a dinner invitation to dine at a nice Italian restaurant with Jesus of Nazareth. And so he goes expecting a prank by some friends, but at least he'll get a nice Italian meal out of it. And so he goes and sits across from this guy at this table who claims to be Jesus. And he discovers in the course of their 5-course meal together, this really is Jesus. And so it's kind of
Hmm.
one of those, who would you want to have dinner with? If you could, kind of scenarios. Or what would you talk to Jesus about if you had him to yourself for 2 hours? So that became my first fiction, which was this novella called Dinner with a Perfect Stranger. And so that was the launch of my fiction career, so to speak.
I love it. So, what really defines Christian fiction? What are the elements? Because, like, people can put religious elements or Christian elements in any fiction, right? In my books, I always talk about different, and their fiction, like different kind of religion. But how would a publisher classify this, or why would like a bookstore put this under the shelf of Christian fiction?
Yeah, most Christian fiction, it tends to be very overtly Christian, which
Okay.
is to say, the characters are Christians, or the characters come to faith in Christ during the course of the book. It's
Okay.
dealing with very Christian themes. Sometimes Christian fiction comes under criticism because
Mm-hmm.
it's too overt. And a lot of Christian fiction has been criticized because it's too preachy, and
Okay.
it hits the reader over the head with whatever the author wants to preach, as
Yeah.
opposed to just writing a really good story with people who happen to be Christians. And if there's any message there that the author wants to get across, it's organic to the story, it's organic to the characters, and it doesn't come across as 4 or 5 pages of now let me preach to the reader. And
Mm.
so that really has been important for me, because my desire in writing Christian fiction, which I'll get to the story of actually what happened with Dinner with a Perfect Stranger in just a minute. But my desire in writing Christian fiction has always been to write fiction that's engaging and entertaining and hopefully gripping,
Yeah.
and that the
So
reader
all
won't
of this.
won't want to put down, whether the reader is a Christian or is not, but they
Yeah.
will find it genuinely an interesting book that they like to read. So that involves good story development, good character development, and if it's really a conversational book like Dinner with a Perfect Stranger is, then truly engaging conversation.
So what is the overall message that you hope to achieve from your books? Do you hope that people will eventually become Christian, or if they're in a different religion, convert to Christianity? What is your like message or hope
Yeah,
maybe?
that certainly was my goal, I suppose, with Dinner with a Perfect Stranger. I actually wrote Dinner with a Perfect Stranger right after I finished seminary. And my goal was to self-publish something that I could just have some copies of to give to friends and give to family and to people that I met, and present the message of Christ and the person of Jesus Christ in a way that hopefully they would find, as I said, engaging and entertaining, and actually want to read the book. And so that was my whole vision for Dinner with a Perfect Stranger. Well, I had a contact at Random House at their Christian publishing division, Waterbury Press, and so I sent them a copy of my self-published version. And so I just said, "Hey, I self-published this book. Just thought I'd send you a copy if you want to take a look at it." So they got back with me and they said, "We want to publish your book." And so I said, "Great." And so we signed a contract, and they were going to print 20,000 copies, which is a lot for a unknown author. And well, as it turned out, by the time the book came out in August of 2005, they printed 200,000 copies. And they
Wow.
launched this huge marketing campaign, had its own write up in Wall Street Journal and USA Today and all this other marketing. And I was on, like, somewhere between 50 and 100 radio interviews across the country, and some cable TV interviews. And within a few weeks, it hit the New York Times extended bestseller list, and they
Wow.
sold 500,000 copies. And so I had this.
Man, that's amazing. You must be loaded.
So all of a sudden, I just wanted a book that I could keep some copies in my garage and hand out to a few people. And all of a sudden, this fiction writing career was dumped in my lap because, needless to say, they wanted me to write more. And so
Wow.
I became a fiction writer. And so since then, I'm on about my 8th book, in addition to the 4 nonfiction books that I've written. And
Huh.
so, yeah, my goal, circling back to your question, my goal in writing the books has been certainly to present the message of Christ, the gospel of Jesus Christ, in a way that is clear to people, and that hopefully they will respond to and in faith, but also to present the person of Christ in a way that, well, actually, honestly, in many of my books, kind of an outside the box manner.
Hmm.
I enjoy giving people kind of a different look at Jesus, and I want that look to be very biblically based. I want honestly to be able to take anything that's in my books, any conversation or part of a conversation or whatever, and if somebody comes back and says, "Okay, where did you get that from?" I want to be able to point to the Gospels or another part of the New Testament or whatever, and say, "Well, actually, it's right here." And so I want it to be very biblically based, but I want it to be, as I said before, wrapped in a story that is a genuine story that will engage people. I don't
Hmm.
want people to feel like they're reading a sermon. I want people to feel like they're reading fiction, and
Interesting.
to continue to read it for that purpose.
Yeah, when I was doing the research for this episode, like you have a huge presence online. You have your own Wikipedia page, you're published by Random House, and I was impressed, and I was like, wow, I didn't know that Christian authors can, like, I always thought of it as like this kind of small
Niche, yeah.
section of publishing, small niche. Some people might call it like fringe or whatever they want to call it, but it's actually huge, and it reminds me of the book that came maybe, I don't know, 10, 15 years ago, The Shack.
Yes,
It was a Christian fiction,
correct.
correct?
Yes.
And I think that was one of the and I would go. I live outside of DC and used to work in DC. Take the metro, go the metro, and people are reading The Shack on the train too. Like, you might think of DC as like a heathen city or
Right.
whatever, but like people were on the train reading The Shack. And it was even like one of my colleagues who was like an Iraqi Muslim. He was like obsessed with that book.
Well, it
And
doesn't surprise me. It sold 20 million copies, so
correct.
it's like we almost all know somebody that's read it. Yeah.
Exactly. I have it somewhere here. And my question, do you think The Shack, that book, changed the perspective of Christian fiction and made it more into the mainstream and made more publishers, big publishers, keen on publishing Christian fiction? Did it change? If there was a stigma against it, I'm not sure, but if there was a stigma, do you think that book removed that stigma, especially among the top 5 publishers?
Yeah, I think that's likely to be the case. Christian fiction
Okay.
is something that kind of, I don't know that it even existed in, the 50s and maybe in the 60s a bit. I mean, It's not to say that Christian fiction had not been written before. I mean, The Pilgrim's
Okay.
Progress by John Bunyan was written, what, in the 1600s, uh, and is one of the best-selling books of all time. C.S. Lewis is famous for his Christian
C.S. Lewis,
fiction,
yeah.
J.R.R. Tolkien. But as an industry segment, I think you're right. Christian fiction kind of began rising in the 70s, but slowly. And so I think the Shack probably had a lot to do with the explosion of Christian fiction and the more of the mainstream acceptance of it as a legitimate segment of the industry. Even before the Shack, the Left Behind series by Tim LaHaye,
About the rapture,
yes,
right?
about had the
Yeah,
same
yeah,
effect. I mean, it sold tens
yeah.
of millions of copies of
I have
its
it here,
various
yeah.
books. Yeah. And
Yeah.
so, yeah, there have been various, and then really successful authors that published numerous books that were very successful, like Ted Decker came along, and so there have been very successful Christian authors who have developed series and that have really highlighted that segment of the industry. I actually have a funny story about the Shack. I had a friend in Oregon when I was living there. He said, "Hey, I want you to come over one Sunday afternoon and meet this guy." And so it was just an association he had with this fellow. And his name was Wayne Jacobson. And so I came over. We had a very nice lunch together, etc. Well, a day later or so, Wayne drives back down to California, which is where he's from, and on the way, he called me and he said, "Hey, I've got this friend that's written this manuscript. Would you be willing to read it?" So I said, "Sure." And so this was kind of after my, 15 minutes of fame with Dinner with a Perfect Stranger. And so he sent it to me and I read it and I got back with him and I said, "I think this is great. I think this book could really go places." Well, the book was The Shack.
Wow.
And so he said, "Would you be willing to endorse the Shack?" And so I said, "Sure." And so when the book came out, originally the self-published version that sold about 1 million copies had,
It was self-published?
yes, it
I
was
didn't know
self-published,
that.
and he sold about 1 million copies before Hachette, the huge book publisher, took it over. And
Oh,
so
wow.
it was hugely successful, even before a major publisher took it. And so, in any case, the original self-published version came out with three endorsements on the cover. One was by Eugene Peterson, who wrote The Message and a bunch of other books. One was by uh, 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 oh, now his name, not John Michael Talbot, Michael W. Smith, the Christian music artist. And then the other one was by me. And then when Hachette took it over, they bumped me to the inside cover. I mean, the inside endorsements. There were like 4
Yeah.
pages of inside endorsements, and
Yeah, yeah.
they put Winona in place of me, her endorsement. And so that was actually useful to me. It kind of helped me to see where I placed in life. I was somewhere between
Mm.
Winona and nobody. So, that was a good judge.
No, but, things can
That's
change.
right. That is right.
Things
Yeah.
can change. Oh, that's fascinating. Okay. So now, I'm a journalist by training, and I like to ask, kind of tough questions. They're not really that tough, but let's see. Buckle up.
Okay.
I listened I listened to a lot of podcasts with authors and publishers because that's what I do for a living. I publish my books, I talk to authors, whatever. I rarely see a podcast or like a mainstream podcast talk or host a Christian author. Is that Do you think I am correct in this observation? And if I am, why do you think so?
Honestly, I have no idea.
Hmm.
So what you're saying is that you see podcasts that are centered around authors, but not podcasts that are just focused on Christian authors.
Or they don't actually invite Christian
Okay.
authors to the podcast, or they think their audience would not be interested in that because that's like very, very niche, for especially when you think of the current political situation in this country, where like the publishing scene is tend to be like mostly in like cities that are
Yes,
liberal,
for sure.
more in the agnostic side, and then for them to bring a Christian author, they think the audience might not respond well to that. Is that correct observation?
Yeah, I think both the things you cited. I think number one, the person who's actually doing the podcast may just not be that interested,
Yeah, yeah.
or may not be particularly aware, like you said before. It's like, oh, this is a bigger part of the industry than I ever knew, and
Yeah,
so they
yeah,
just and they may not honestly be aware of who the significant Christian or the leading Christian authors may be, or who interesting ones would be to chat with. And
yeah.
so, you can't fault somebody for that. But I think too, there may be be an assumption that my audience isn't going to be that interested in this. And so I think probably that comes into play too. That I think that's very likely.
Do you get invited on podcasts that are not Christian leaning?
Yes, I have been invited to do many such podcasts that are not Christian leaning, including some that
Okay,
have been overseas.
okay,
One from India, I remember in particular. So yeah, I really enjoy doing both.
okay,
And I
okay,
find that I can have good conversations in both contexts. And so yeah,
okay,
both of
okay.
them are work well with me.
All right. So I want to talk about your audience. I think that's a segue to this. Who is your audience? Who's your audience? Or
Well,
who do you wish to be your audience? Because, the saying, like preaching to the converted,
right.
literally, who is your audience? Who reads this book? The already converted or the skeptics or the people who are questioning? Like, who do you think is mainly your audience?
Mostly I think my audience is if you had to pigeonhole my audience, they would be the primary audience would be female Christians between the ages of 35 and 70.
Huh. Why is that? Why
I say
female?
that because about 80% of the readers of Christian books are women,
In general.
or maybe just books in general. But yeah, I do know that about 80% of the readers of Christian books are women.
Yeah.
Um, and I say, skewing to a somewhat older demographic in large part because young people just don't read as much these days. And
Correct.
so,
Yeah.
people that are 35 and older, they simply read more than people, 15 to 35.
Okay.
Whenever you know, I came out with a book a year ago called my second full length novel. Most of my books have been short novellas, 100 to 150
Yeah.
pages. But my second novel that I came out with last year is called One of Us, and I have a friend who ended up giving it to her grandson or grandnephew or something. Anyway, he was like 14 and he devoured it in 2 days. I mean, it's a full length novel, and he loved it. And he told his grandmother, he said, I feel like I've really come to know the person of Jesus so much better by having read this. And so I've gotten really good feedback from younger people who have read some of my books, but I recognize they're not the main people who are picking them up. And so I think for the most part, my books are picked up by other Christians, some people who aren't Christians, which is great. But I think, or at least my hope is always that, if a Christian picks up one of my books and really likes it and thinks it will appeal to one of their friends that's not a Christian, then I always love to hear that they've, given it away or given a new one to them as a gift or whatever. And I've really had the fantastic privilege various times. I was on a flight a couple of years ago from Florida back to Houston, and so I was talking with this guy who was sitting in the seat in the row ahead of me, and we were just chatting back and forth. And I said, "What do you do for a living?" And he told me, blah blah blah. And so he said, "What do you do for a living?" I said, "Well, I'm an author. What kind of books do you write?" Well, these kind. And tell me something you've written. So I said, "Well, my best-selling book was a little book called Dinner with a Perfect Stranger." And his eyes get big and his jaw drops, and he said, "You've got to be kidding. God used that book to help bring me to faith in Christ." And this was a Jewish guy.
Wow.
So I'm the recipient of stories like that from people from time to time, either in person or email or whatever. And so that's always a thrill to hear. Look, my book really impacted somebody in a really significant way.
And how receptive are bookshops to stocking Christian books, like mainstream bookstores like Barnes and Noble and other independent stores? And you don't see them like in the front of the bookstore, like or editor's pick or whatever. Because I go to Barnes and Noble all the time and I just browse. You won't see that
Yeah,
unless it was the Shack. Only the
right.
Shack was
I was
probably
exactly about to say that. Unless it was the Shack, they
the
put that one
Shack.
up in
Yeah,
the front. Yeah. Um,
correct.
well, I think realistically there is a religion section in
Okay.
virtually every bookstore. Some of them might have, a larger religion section that is broken down into, Christian and then, other religions or whatever. And sometimes, they will have the subsections, and oftentimes one of the big subsections is Christian fiction. And so I've
Mm,
certainly walked into bookstores where, the Christian fiction section is really quite large. I mean, get row after row after row after row. And so I think in particular the half price books, there's a huge used bookstore in Dallas called Half Price Books, and the Christian fiction section in Half Price Books just goes on forever. But Dallas is kind of
mm,
right there in the Bible
right.
Belt, and there are a lot of
Yeah.
Christians there, and so those books would sell well there. Yeah.
Do you think they would ever put them in the regular fiction section? Like if I go to the fiction section where there's, I don't know, Stephen King and whatever, and would they stock them right next to them? Or would they always put them under the religion section?
My experience has been that they're almost always in a section called Christian fiction within the religion section,
But it won't be within the fiction section.
not within the fiction section. Yeah. I don't
Which is it's a curious
It is.
observation.
Yeah, I've never really thought about that. You're right. Yeah, they tend to put it
Yeah,
in the
yeah.
religion section, not within the fiction section, which,
Okay.
yeah.
Yeah. But yeah. Anyways, so what are you working on these days?
Well, actually, when it comes to books, the book that I'm currently working on is kind of a fairy tale book.
Oh wow.
I've never really written children's book before, and this really isn't a children's book so much as it is a book that's kind of a children's story that both children and adults could read. And so
Okay.
it's kind of more like along the lines of maybe The Little Prince or something like that,
Okay.
a 10-year-old could read, but a 50-year-old could just as easily read and get more out of it than the 10-year-old did. And so I'm working on that at the moment. Mostly this last year, I've kind of been involved in marketing the latest book that I wrote called One of Us. So I'm also I've been working on helping sell my first full length novel called The Last Christian as a possible streaming series in Hollywood. A guy from
Oh, wow.
a guy from Hollywood contacted me exactly a year ago, actually, emailed me and said, I read your book, The Last Christian. I thought it was fantastic. I want to see if I can develop it into a streaming series out here. And so he wrote a pilot script and put together a pitch deck for it. And so I helped him edit the script and so forth. And so that is in process. And in addition to that, I've had various people express interest in my latest book called One of Us as a possible either movie or streaming series. And so I seem to
Oh,
be
wow.
kind of moving in that direction of hopefully some of my material. Well, three of my books have already been put into movie form. Dinner with a Perfect Stranger and its two sequels, A Day with a Perfect Stranger and Night with a Perfect Stranger. Feature films have all been made of those by an independent film producer in Louisville named Jefferson Moore. And that too just came totally out of the blue. He emailed me one day and said, this is back in 2005, and said, I read your self-published version of Dinner with a Perfect Stranger. I want to make a movie of it. And
Wow.
so I said, great. So we signed a contract. This is how everything seems to happen with me. So I said, great. We signed a contract. He made a movie and sold tons of DVDs. This was back in 2005. And it aired a zillion times on Trinity Broadcasting Network, TBN, and so have its sequels. And so the movies have really got quite a large audience, both in DVD form and on cable.
Huh. Wow. Well, if you need anyone to play Mary,
Yeah, you'd be great.
since I'm the since I'm the original Arab Christian, I'm from the Holy
That's
Land,
right.
so
You'd be great
it's
for it.
it's just a joke. So, do you still have the same publisher, which is Random House?
Let's see. Random House published four of my books. One, two,
Okay.
three, four. Yes, the last one was The Last
Okay.
Christian, my first full-length novel. I had a book published by Harvest. One book published by a couple of books published by a couple of fairly large Christian publishers, but not huge mainstream publishers. Harvest House
Okay.
Publishers and Tyndale House Publishers, and another one published by Worthy Publishing out of Nashville. And so those have been my kind of traditional publishing route. I've also self-published several of my books. My latest book, which I'd love for the movie thing to to occur, I self-published. And so I
Oh.
also have a decent amount of experience going the self-published route. All of my nonfiction books I self-published.
So it's interesting. Like you got a publisher from like one of the top five, which is a dream for authors,
Right.
and then you went back and self-published. I'm curious why.
Well, mostly it was just because out of necessity, because my kind of the opposite of how most people's career developed. My huge career success happened right at the beginning, and as I said, was a total shock to me. And so, as I continued to write, for various reasons, my sales success was not as much as it had been before. And so, I got to the point to where in the last my last book that was published by a mainstream publisher was 2016, and so I've been self-publishing for the last 9 years. And so the market has changed so much, and so publishers are really looking for certain things from an author. They're looking obviously for a really good book, but in addition to that, they want either a recent track record of really good sales, which I no longer had, or they want somebody with a ready-made platform. And
Mm,
so, if you're a mega church pastor and you have 20,000
yeah,
people coming to your church every Sunday and, probably another 100,000 listening on radio or podcasts to you or whatever, then it's like, okay, well, there's a ready-made audience.
yeah,
In addition, obviously, in today's climate of social media, if you have a huge YouTube following or Instagram following or whatever, well, that doesn't really. I mean, I'm on those media, but I don't have huge followings by any means. And so, a publisher, basically, so much of the marketing of books has gone from something the publisher does, which was the traditional route, to now, even if you get published by a traditional publisher, unless you're a huge name, if you're Donald Trump and you know, you come out after your current term with a book, well, you don't have to do much to market it. But if you're not
correct.
a huge name,
Yeah,
then you're expected to do most of the marketing for it, even though you've got a traditional publisher who's publishing it. And so really it presents additional challenges to authors because being a good writer isn't enough anymore. You have to be a good marketer too. But it
correct,
also presents some opportunities because if you go the self-publishing route, essentially you're doing the marketing work that you would have to do if you were published by a traditional publisher anyway. And you're getting to
correct,
keep more of the profits. And so there are pluses and
correct.
minuses to the changes that have come to the industry.
Hmm. And what is like in terms of what moved the needle for you in terms of marketing? What was your kind of the highest ROI?
I'm not sure that anything has really moved the needle because I'm not that great of a marketer.
But like, if you look at the books, since you're
Yes.
self-published, and me too, so I look at always the KDP reports page and see. Do you think, like, especially now, where many authors they say like put clips on TikTok or go on podcasts, where do you feel you're getting the most traction?
Honestly, I think I'm getting most traction simply by word of mouth. So I think
Mm,
the podcasts that I'm on probably help because,
okay.
just simply exposure
Yeah,
to
yeah,
to
yeah,
and putting books into the hands of people that I think, okay, I genuinely think they're going to be interested in this book, and this is somebody that could actually let a decent number of other people know about the book.
yeah,
I
yeah.
think that has been perhaps the most effective thing for me.
So we know that authors are big readers. What do you read? Do you read only Christian fiction? If not, if mainstream fiction, if you want to call it that way, who do you think influenced you the most, or like somebody that you really like to read?
Well, this is going to sound ridiculous for a Christian, for excuse me, for a fiction author to say. I read very little fiction. I'm not primarily a fiction reader. I'm primarily a nonfiction
Okay,
reader. About
okay,
95% of everything I read is nonfiction. That's
okay,
that's that's always the way I've been. And
okay.
so among the fiction writers that I've really liked a lot, I would say the one that historically appealed to me the most was Michael Crichton. I loved Michael Crichton's
Mm,
work. I really enjoyed Dan Brown's work, the author of the Da Vinci Code, and
yeah, the Vinci Code. Yeah,
he actually I'm reading a Dan Brown book right now called Deception Point. I mean, the Da Vinci Code was complete nonsense from a historical perspective, I remember listening
Mm.
to when the Da Vinci Code came out. I remember listening to a radio show, and the host of the show was interviewing somebody who was a historian. I mean, an expert in like early church history, first century history, so forth. And he said, okay, Dan Brown kind of talks about a lot of historical stuff in his book, the Da Vinci Code. How much of it is actually true? And the expert said, well, Paris is a real city, and Leonardo da Vinci was a real painter.
That's it? Yeah, but actually think of it, Da Vinci Code was sort of a Christian fiction, no? I mean,
No,
it was a lot about the Catholic Church
it
and
had a lot of religious subject matter in it, but it definitely wasn't Christian fiction. If anything, it was anti-Christian fiction. But it was a
true,
real
true.
page turner. I really loved reading it.
Yeah.
But it was
I was obsessed with
yeah,
it, I
yeah, yeah.
remember. And like it made me understand Rome better,
Yes.
and the Catholic Church and the traditions, and so I think it kind of sent a message somehow. Yeah. Wow. So David, this has been wonderful. And how can people reach you, buy your books, if they want to make a movie out of your book? How can I remember I'm married. So
That's
I'm
right.
just
That's right.
joking. Okay.
Actually,
Um
in my latest book, One of Us, there is a Mary character, and she is
okay.
she is the mother of Jesus.
Okay.
It's placed in the present tense, so essentially it's the story of the four gospels put in 21st century America. And so the
Wow.
Jesus character is Manuel, and he's Mexican American from auto mechanic from McAllen, Texas, and his
Wow.
mother lives in the Rio Grande Valley as well. Her name is Maria. So you can be Maria.
Yeah, I'll be Maria. I speak Spanish as well, so I
Oh,
can manage.
wonderful. All right. There
Yeah,
we go.
okay.
So if somebody wants to look into any of my books further, I'd love for them to visit my website, which is davidgregorybooks.com, or they can contact me through the website anytime. And all my books are up on Amazon. Various of them are in other places like bn.com or wherever books are usually sold.
That's great. Thank you, David. This has been enlightening, fun, and as I said, it's a unique episode because you're the first Christian author on this podcast. And for anyone watching or listening, thank you for joining us for another episode of Read and Write with Natasha. And until we meet again.